Well, it is a pleasure for me to introduce you to Emily Chang. In my book, she is equal parts rock star professionally and humanitarian. Emily Chang, welcome to our show.
Thank you for having me.
Absolutely. So, as an anthropologist, I'm always fascinated by people's backstories because in there is a treasure that I find really serves as indicators for what people's lives become. So let's start with your childhood and a bit about your family. I am interested to know, and I know that everyone listening will feel the same, what your upbringing was like and where you were raised.
I was born in the States, in Atlanta, Georgia, to parents who were still going through their postgraduate degrees. And looking backwards, I think this is something that I far underestimated and underappreciated as a child. I remember my father, who I saw as a child as this nerdy Chinese man. He would tell me how difficult it was for him to study a PhD in chemical engineering, which as an adult now I respect, but as a child don't understand. He explained to me how his roommate was starting something on the football team. And so he was just night and day with his roommate. He didn't speak any English or read or write any English, studying a PhD in chemistry. So he would tell me how he would translate word for word from his textbooks all night. It's something that now I can deeply appreciate and realize with such gratitude that my parents did so much to give me and my younger brother such a different opportunity growing up. So I think we were talking about heritage a little bit on email. My heritage is Chinese American. I also identify with this unique group of kids who were raised by people who had just come over from China and were trying to make their way in the US. There was a book that was interesting called Tiger Mom, Battle Hymn of the Tiger Mom. There was a follow-up book called The Tiger Babies Bite Back or something like that. I think I was one of the tiger baby generations.
And with your parents being so accomplished and actually achieving so much, having just come from China and relocating in the United States, in Atlanta, did you ever feel that there was any degree of pressure on you to do well, to perform? I mean, culturally, because I'm part Chinese too, there's something in our culture that encourages children to do well. Did you feel any of that growing up?
Absolutely. I think it's no unique circumstance. Many millions of not just Chinese, but Asian children grow up under extreme pressure to do extremely well. I think two things strike me about this. One is, however it lands with the child, it's intended positively by the parents, because they've given up so much to try and give their children a better opportunity. And therefore, the pressure of the child to be successful and then the pressure of validating everything the parents gave up sort of adds on another layer of stress, anxiety, and responsibility. I think that's tough for a kid. I think the other thing that is a unique element is, while you may be in China raised this way, that might be one thing, but when you're in America, raised with a very heavy hand and very, very strict household rules and extremely high expectations, there's a disconnect, I think, that can also happen.
Yes, that's absolutely true. I completely understand. So how did you navigate that as a child? I mean, clearly you were in Georgia, and I imagine, although I don't want to make any assumptions, that, there may not have been a large Asian community around you. So how did you navigate that time in your life?
Well, I was born in Atlanta. We went up and down the East Coast. My understanding is that there was one point when we were in Wisconsin. We may have been the only Asians for many miles around, but I really grew up from the third grade on in upstate New York. So it was a little bit probably more diverse, I guess, in that respect. I do remember growing up Monday through Friday, being in a very predominantly white Very, very good school system. And then on the weekends, spending all of my time with my parents' friends. So going to Chinese school, going to piano lessons, swimming lessons, ballet lessons. It's literally, straight out of a textbook, I suppose. And in the evenings, all the parents would get together with potluck and play mahjong, and the children would go to the basement. So it was a sort of tale of two cities in some ways. And I think the benefit of this is you learn growing up to bridge cultures. So when you go to school Monday through Friday and your parents pack a Chinese lunch for you to take, and you have to explain why it's not gross or what it is you're eating, or when you're trying to squeeze in Chinese homework between classes, then on the other hand, you're trying to help your Chinese parents understand what's going on in school and why you would like to go to, the float making party. They don't understand for the life of them why Americans build floats. You just shove tissue paper into this big thing and then you roll it down the street. Seems like a big waste of time.
But isn't it fascinating how your early years have served you so well in your professional life? So I'd love to explore the part of your life that defined what your career became. I mean, you are a rock star by any standard in the way that you lead. And so when you were younger, did you have an idea or did you have aspirations of what you wanted to do with your life?
No. In fact, you mentioned an email that you were going to call this series Wayfinders, right?
Yes.
I think that's such a good description for how my career sort of unfolded, because I didn't have a lot of vision. When I was in the 7th grade, I was completely certain I was going to be a pediatric oncologist. Everything I did was building up my pre-med status so that I could get into med school. And everything I studied was science and math focused. And then I realized, in fact, that I don't have the emotional distance to do the thing that I felt really, really drawn to do. And I think that was a very good life lesson, which is there might be a real passion area in your life. You can definitely feed it. It may not have to be your career. So when I realized that I needed to pivot, I started heading in a different direction without a lot of time, really about a month to go. I had to figure out what I wanted to do if I wasn't going to med school. So instead of the MCATs, I took the GMATs and got into business school, had no idea what business people did. So I studied corporate finance, thinking finance is a bit like science. That's really all I knew. And every step for the last 23 years has been wayfinding. It has been being open to learn, being benefiting from some amazing people who leaned into me and gave me advice or helped me, advised where they thought they might see me successful, and then sort of being willing to take lateral moves or moves that don't seem to make sense in a traditional career building way, but really benefited me because I was able to go quite broad. I was able to experience different industries. And I think going broad is one of the best things we can do, because we can start learning the environment, the types of bosses, the types of industries, and the size of company, the company culture, the context in which we thrive. And a lot of times you're not going to nail right away, this is it. But slowly when you say, this is not it, and that's not it, and that doesn't work for me, and I don't love this, you start narrowing in on that space that really is where you can thrive.
That's very interesting about going laterally. I don't think I've ever heard that before, but it makes so much sense. So during the course of when you started to discover areas that you really wanted to hone in on, did you make a point of seeking out mentors or people who were actually role modeling what it is you wanted to do? And then how did you seek them out? And then 2, how did they serve the development of your career?
Before I had the terminology, I was seeking out mentors. I think I knew early on I needed help. And maybe somebody asked me recently, what's the secret to your success? I said, I think I'm far from successful. It depends on the metric. But if I would call where I am successful, I would attribute it to being open to asking for help. I remember applying for an internship that was a really, really fantastic way to get started in the professional world. And I got it. I was shocked I got it. And only 1 month into the internship, I was behind a shelf and overheard some people saying, basically, I got it because I was the only one who applied. There are times where I didn't know what to do, and I would just look around and try and figure out who seemed the most adept at what I was not good at, and just reaching out and saying, hey, can I buy you coffee? Can you teach me? I think people are more willing to help than we expect.
Yes.
I think people want to see us successful. The only thing that can get in our way is ego or pride or wanting to look smarter or more accomplished. But if we're willing to just say, I don't know, I think people are very willing to come alongside and help. And once I started benefiting from some amazing people who came alongside and lifted me up, then I started realizing sometimes they'll come alongside and see your potential and lift you up when you haven't asked, but you need. And then you start realizing I need to intentionally foster mentorship or advocacy so that there are people who can help me, whether I know I need the help right now or not.
That's really valuable insight, Emily. I mean, I can think of so many instances where I've done the same, but I've always relied on mentors and I've always looked for role models who were just ahead of what it is I wanted to do. So in the course of your career, because mentors have been so important, I'd like to take a step back with your professional journey. So you started at Procter & Gamble and you were there for 11 years. Is that right?
That's right.
And how did that then catapult you into the next job? And because I see this very interesting trajectory in your professional life that really has led you to bridge the world in China. Did that start at Procter & Gamble?
Yeah, it definitely did. It definitely did. And I think it goes back to that willing to go broad. When I joined P&G, I was recruited for corporate finance. And one of the most amazing women who I still stay in touch with, Paris Watts-Stanfield, said on the day of extending the offer to me, you can have this corporate finance internship, but I actually think you'd be really good in general management, just based on the very little I know of you. So she gave up her slot for me to be her finance intern. And I reapplied to be a brand management intern. And that's how I started with P&G in 1999. And I'm so grateful to her. Having joined, not knowing anything about brand management, when they ask you up front, because P&G is amazing, one of the best training grounds. And I am so glad I started there because now I work in a very different place that is not so resource rich. And I think, wow, when I was young, I kind of took some of that for granted. But while I was there, I had the amazing opportunity to immediately fill out what is my career plan and what is my work and development plan and all these amazing things that P&G does to support new incoming people for success. And I remember trying to fill out this form. I didn't even realize how prestigious it was to get into P&G at that time. And so it was asking, what do you want to do? And I think probably a lot of people had very clear thought out answers for this is what I want my career to look like. This is what I want to do. I didn't know. So I remember I just wrote one line, which was, I would like to see as much of business as I can. And because P&G is such a big company, and because they really do refer back to these things, I had the opportunity to work across all three business units. I got to go from front-end innovation down to retailer marketing, working in Arkansas with the Walmart customer team, working in Guangzhou. So that was my first opportunity. Again, I had kind of raised my hand and said, I'll go anywhere. I'll do anything. I want to learn as much as I can end to end. So somebody had kept that in mind, a very, very good mentor and still friend, Ravi Chaturvedi. And he invited me to be a brand manager to get promoted into my first brand manager role in Guangzhou, China, back in 2003 or 2004. So I think, again, being willing to learn, being willing to go broad and lateral, and just raising your hand and saying, I'll do that. I would love to go learn something and see a different part of the business that I don't know today. So those 11 years went really quickly.
What I hear in all of this is that you cultivated relationships and lasting relationships with people. And that bodes very well for you. I mean, it speaks to who you are and to your nature, which is what we'll get into in just a moment, because it is one of the things that absolutely captivates me about you. One of the many things that captivates me about you. I'd like to know how you were able to, with this professional velocity, how you were able to balance that out with your personal life, with responsibilities to yourself and to your family.
Perhaps I'm comfortable in the messy middle. I'm comfortable with discomfort. One of my TEDx talks was on killing chickens. And it was this idea of knowing what your own discomfort index is and then setting yourself up for success by leaning into that. So, defining if you love a more comfortable place where you know what success looks like and you know the framework in which you are expected to deliver results, maybe your discomfort index is quite low. My discomfort index is really high. I like that feeling of not exactly knowing what's going to happen next, not knowing how to get there, but knowing where the destination is. I think that was what my childhood was growing up, constantly trying to figure things out and always feeling humbled, always feeling not good enough, not successful enough, not in a negative way, but truly just in a humbling, like I'm very small in a very big world kind of way. And because of that, I think I've been much more open to just trying new things.
What's so fascinating about what you just said is I was groomed and mentored by Wayfinders. I mean, some of the greatest Wayfinders in the Pacific. And one of the qualities that is tantamount to them is humility. And what I have learned is that our greatest leaders across sectors and cultures and traditions is humility. Just a quiet humility that says, what can I learn? How can I be better? And I've always believed that we cannot master what we do not love, but that love is cultivated through a deep reverence and passion for something, and you certainly represent that. So let's move into the spare room. I was so inspired and actually wept through parts of your book and encourage people to read it because it says so much about your humanity. And I am curious to know if you're even aware of where that humanity began in you.
Well, I think we're shaped by those pivotal moments, whether they're things that happen to us or whether they're a choice on how we want to help somebody else land in a tough situation. Growing up, I was what we called a latchkey kid in the US. So the rules were very different back then. And the kids were allowed to wear latchkey, a key wrapped around your neck, and you would let yourself in after school. And you had to figure out how to take care of yourself. And my little brother, who at the time I think was 3 or 4, and it was sort of working your way through a lot of unclear situations, sometimes feeling like you need help and not knowing where to turn, pre-cell phones, pre-internet, I'm pretty sure, and just having to figure out how to raise your hand and go find a neighbor who you might not even know and say, I need help. I got locked out, or I can't find my brother. He didn't come home. I think trying to figure out how to work through the tougher situations, I always remembered those moments. And there's no sort of blame associated with 2 working parents. They were doing everything they could to give us a better life. But in those moments, you feel really helpless. You feel out of your depth. You don't know what to do. Maybe that's a part of that humility as well. You always think, you just don't know what's going to happen next. So when I see young children, vulnerable children, especially those who feel stuck or don't have anyone to help them, I think it touches a very sensitive part in my own heart. And I think those kids are the ones that really speak to me. I think there are a million problems in the world. My daughter has been really focused on animal rescue, and that's something that's really close to me too. I'm desperately trying to improve our sustainability efforts at work. We're trying to reduce plastic and electricity and just do all these things. But vulnerable children are probably the thing that touched me the most. And, in the book, we have this simple sort of diagram on your offer and your offense. And for me, that's definitely my offense. So that's probably the thing that's always called to me. That's probably why I wanted to be a pediatric oncologist. And thank goodness I didn't end up going into that career, but I do think in a very different way, I've been able to serve that passion.
Yeah. I mean, I'm just, there almost aren't any words actually when it comes to what you've done. And so for our listeners, can you give us a brief synopsis of what the spare room is and how it came to be?
Sure. in some ways, we're really proud as a family of what we've done, but I think in other ways, it's worth remembering it's still a small thing. I just hope that the small thing, by capturing it in a book and sharing, can have an amplifying effect and become a bigger thing. So the spare room is a euphemism. It's a euphemism for that intersection of what you uniquely have to offer and your offense. Between those two things, you discover what I'm calling your social legacy, because life purpose is such a scary overarching concept. Social legacy is simply, legacy means you're leaving something better than you found it. And isn't that a great end goal, very simply put, with this one life of ours? And then social defines the space in which you want to have that influence. So for us, the spare room is a key part of our offer. We have a spare room. We have a small but deeply joyful, unified family. And those are the things that we offer. There's some other things that we kind of put in there. And then the offense I'd already talked about. So the integration of those two things is, how do we care for anybody who needs a safe place to live for as long as they need it? And we stumbled into it. This is not, it wasn't super intentional in the beginning. It wasn't like anybody raised their hand and said, I really want to be a good person and create a spare room initiative or a movement. But now, I think it was probably after 8 or 9 kids, and we've had 17 total in the last 22 years. It was really sort of halfway through, we're like, gosh, this kind of keeps happening bizarrely. Like, kids just keep landing on our doorstep, or somebody will say, will you take this child? Will you take this baby? And we realized a couple of things. One is, we're leaning into yes. And the more you lean into yes, the more those needs will come find you. I don't know how to explain it other than it just keeps happening. And the other thing I'd say is, when you say yes, there's so much abundance that comes into your life. There's so much richness. So it might sound like we are doing something philanthropic and helping these kids who need help. Of course, we're willing to help them. But I have to say with absolute certainty, we are blessed beyond measure. We get to see some of the most amazing, miraculous transformations. We get to help people who then go on to live extraordinary lives. And ultimately, the reason it became a book is, I deeply, deeply believe that everybody has a social legacy in them. Everybody has unique offers. Everybody's called to this unique offense. And everyone has the chance to live into something that will make their life so much more abundant. And then I think there's this other practical element, which is, it makes you so much more effective at work, because nothing takes down the walls of hierarchy. Nothing injects humanity into leadership like seeing who the person is and understanding their heart. And I think that goes back to humility, a sense of being okay with the messy middle, because not everyone's comfortable. And I won't say I'm always comfortable with people seeing me crying over a little boy who I had to bring into work with me because nobody else will take him. Those aren't comfortable, very professional, polished moments, but I also lean into them knowing that they help people see me for who I am. And I think that is worth more than looking always polished and perfect, but having a divide between you and others around you.
Completely. I agree wholeheartedly. It's so interesting as I'm listening to you, because most people have the impression that they will do something and help others when their lives are settled, when they have, enough of a grounding that they can do this, that they have the capacity or the bandwidth for this. And the first young woman that you brought in, you were actually going to school, you were in college, and you didn't have a spare room. You basically were in a studio. And so talk to us about that, because I would love for people to know that we don't need to delay social legacy.
I think that's a great point. Again, I think I kind of lucked into this because I saw a little girl sitting on the side of the street, and long story short, she needed some help, clearly. And I can't even say in my heart, I was all full of charity and goodness and wanting to help her. I was sort of like, oh, it's late. I'm tired. I really want to go home. If I'm honest, that's how I felt. And yet I could not keep driving when I could see somebody was injured and sitting in the sleeting rain in upstate New York. So I brought her home. And I think our capacity far exceeds any imagination of what we think it might be. If you asked me as a junior or senior in college, holding down 3 jobs, putting myself through school, if I would like to take in a teen prostitute who had run away from home for about 4 months, I would have asked if you were out of your mind. There's no way I would have been able to do this. And yet I just took her to dinner, and I couldn't watch her walk back out into the rain with ripped clothing, a fat lip, and a bruised eye. So I just told her to crash on my couch. That's it. So I could pay for dinner. I think it was at Perkins or Friendly's, cheap diner food. And then stay one night in my place, borrow some clothes, and then stay 2 nights, and then stay a week. And before you know it, she stayed with me for a couple of months. So we don't have to take that huge leap and say, this is going to be the end state. This is what I'm going to have to do. And my God, I don't have the energy for it. We just have to take that first step. And the whole thing sort of opens up or blossoms in a way you can't even imagine. And you look back and you think, I can't have imagined life without her in my apartment.
I mean, truly, because then you talk about when Teo came into your life, and you and your husband were discussing whether or not this would, that your daughter would be able to deal with all of this. Will you share a bit of that with us?
Yeah, so we'd had quite a few kids, young, old. Leanie's had younger brothers, sisters, older brothers, sisters, every combination. And we had just had somebody leave the house not long before. And then we got this call. And they weren't really connected, but one thread led to the other. And it's a long story, but suffice it to say, the yes leads to more yes. And this nonprofit had been sort of in an orphanage and saw this little boy who was dying. And he had been born with hydrocephalus, which is water in the brain. So the cerebrospinal fluid goes up, but it can't come back down. Babies' skulls are soft, so it was swelling, very painful, causes a lot of damage to the brain. A doctor had maybe tried to or didn't even try to install a shunt, which is sort of a straw that threads through, drains the fluid into the stomach. Instead, he drilled a hole in this baby's head. So when this nonprofit found this baby lying in the corner of an orphanage that doesn't have heat, so they bundle up the babies, but he's in extreme pain. There's brain fluid leaking out the back of his head, and it's cold in an orphanage, and he's screaming constantly. So they said, could you just take him for a couple of days? He just needs a place to pass away that's warm. He's disrupting all the other babies. And that's when we were thinking, my daughter was maybe 4 at the time. Thought that's a little much for her, that kind of screaming, because we could hear it in the background. And it was when she came around the corner, she heard us talking. She stuck that little finger out. She was like, what you talking about? And when we told her, her first reaction was, you said orphanages don't always have heat. And I said, yeah, but they bundle up the kids. And she said, he's hurting, he's dying, and he doesn't have heat. What are we thinking about? Let's go get him. Wait now. So she couldn't say her R's yet, which was wonderful. And so we went and got him and brought him home. And it was really terrible. I won't lie. He was screaming. Nobody slept more than an hour at a time at night for a month. He was in constant pain, but he didn't die. He kind of sort of came to life, because when he came to our house, he couldn't move. His head was so swollen and heavy and in pain. He would just kind of lie there, and his eyes were just glazed, and he didn't know how to make any noise. He didn't know that his hands were attached to his body. When babies have that realization and they kind of go, oh, I can do this. He'd never had that. He was about 18 months old. But my daughter would lie next to him every day. My husband would lie on the ground and hold up an iPad or peel oranges for him to smell. We would all sing to him. We all loved playing music. And he just started to kind of come around. And then his eyes would follow us. And then he would kind of start making these little gurgling noises. And, this baby, we'd seen the CAT scan, and it was basically a skull with nothing inside. All the brain mass was gone. So a baby who was predicted by every medical professional to never be able to understand anything we said, to never be able to speak, would not have any balance to ever sit up by himself, much less, stand on his own. Over the next couple years, did all of those things. We had a whiteboard over where we had dinner with him. And I remember I would always be in, my stilettos and go to work and sit in a wonderful Herman Miller chair throughout the day. And then I would come home and take off my heels, and we would sit at this tiny IKEA kids table on the floor so that we could sit with him. Because at that point he could sit up. My knees, even I'm very short, but my knees were in my chest, and all of us would sit there and eat dinner with Teo on the floor, basically on the floor. And above him, we would keep track of all the words he was able to say, not mimic, but you had to know he understood the meaning of the word, and he could say it himself. And by the time he became introduced to his forever family, he had 196 words. He was singing songs. He was feeding himself. I mean, this boy is an absolute miracle. He's turning 11 and he lives in Texas now with his family.
Emily, it's such a powerful testament to you, your daughter, your husband, and Teo. And the idea of just being able to vision you as a leader in a large company, then coming home and sitting at a small little IKEA table is so, to me, that really is a poignant reminder about the capacity within all of us. And I mean, not only are you, I've met many people in my life. I've never met anyone like you. And it seems as though your daughter is also one of those women that we will look forward to knowing and celebrating along the way. In closing, and this has been, I thank you for your time. In closing, will you talk to us about social legacy and perhaps just some very simple ideas of how we can cultivate that in our own lives?
Yeah, the first thing I'd say is everybody has a passion, right? And I think there's this current model, which is, let me tell you about my passion and why it's important, and let me fundraise and try and convince you that this is your thing. There's nothing wrong with that. It's all very positively intentioned. Yet, imagine the amplifying effect when everybody centers in on their thing. And I've met other people who open their spare room to kids. Imagine we now find each other and we become this tribe who are all centered on the same social legacy. How powerful that is. I've been watching, the book includes 15 other stories of people from all walks of life, all different places around the world. And her thing is ocean plastics. And she has met others now specifically about how are we going to get those masses of plastic out of the ocean that are killing all the sea creatures. And when you see them all connect and click, something amazing happens. So it's a different paradigm in a lot of ways. And what I'd say is, if you go through the book, it's written like somebody who worked at Procter & Gamble for 11 years. It's workbook style. So it helps you land on your own as you go through each chapter. It creates an action plan, because no Procter & Gamble person would ever leave anything without a good, proper action plan. But even if you don't buy the book, even if you don't go through the exercises, if you have a sense of what that space is, just start looking into who else might have that space. That's how you and I met, Dr. Elizabeth. And it was like a meshing of souls the very first time we talked to each other. And maybe our social legacies aren't exactly the same, but we both share a love of contributing more than we consume, of leaving things better than we found them, and of telling stories that can touch people and inspire them to do the same. So I guess we've created our own tribe, and this is a great example of how, if you lean into your social legacy, you will find amazing people you may never have met otherwise.
That is really, I mean, to me, that's tantamount in terms of advice, because there are people who, like you and I, are halfway around the world, and yet there was a spark of commonality between us. And of course, I so look forward to knowing your beautiful daughter. So in closing, I'd love to know what you're, now that we've talked about how P&G always created, and encouraged people in terms of their planning, their life planning. What plans do you have for yourself after your position at McGann, or after your professional life? What do you see ahead for Emily Chang?
I'm so open. It's a very bizarre thing to describe. But earlier you made the comment of sometimes we plan to wait. We'll wait and do it when, right? I had that thought before about this book. I really felt this deep urge to write this book, and I've never written, published anything ever, but I just felt the stories were worthy to be told, not us, but of the kids. And then I started thinking, but why do we always say, I'll do that when I retire? And especially in this case, some of the stories were already 20 years old and they were starting to fade. And I wanted to make sure I was being as accurate as I could. And so I took a year off and I called it my professional halftime, and I wrote the book. So what I would have said is, wow, one day I'll retire. I would love to teach and I would love to write this book. But I feel like in my job, I get to teach every day. And these are opportunities where I get to share and speak. That's a huge passion of mine. I don't have to wait until I retire. And the book was already written. So from here on out, it's just wide open. I love my job. And I've realized working in a creative space, only the boring get bored, right? There's no end of opportunity or innovation or trying new things. It's only if you stop trying, looking for them or creating them. So I love my job. I love this book project. Somebody signed on to make it into a film. So that's going to be an exciting next step. And I'm just looking forward to seeing what unfolds next. And I think this whole idea of wayfinding or going broad, I'm 46 and I'm still happily going broad. I'm really, really joyfully in a career I love, and I love where this book and this sort of spare room movement is starting to go. And I just look forward with anticipation. I don't have any objectives, and I think that's sometimes the best way to live.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of just such immense promise around the spare room and its philosophy and precepts. And just to back up for a moment, I remember you telling me in a prior call that someone had actually come into your office and seen photographs and asked about them. Was that the beginning of the book?
It was the beginning of the concept of the spare room. So that was Will Travis. He was in my office talking about work, and I was being very worky. I remember he was saying this, I was being very professional. I felt he was trying to sell his agency to me. I'm sorry, Will, it's how I felt. And so I was sort of like, I have an agency. I'm happy to meet you. And then he looked around the corner and saw this corner full is where I kind of did yoga if I had a little break between meetings, and it had all these kids, some of my, of Lainey, and then some of all the other kids. And he was like, who are all these children? And when I mentioned it, we started talking about that. And then we had a very casual conversation. Then we went and had a drink, and I dropped him at the hotel, and he said, can I just tell you something? You're a lovely executive, but you're a much nicer human. And he said, as soon as I saw that wall of photos, you turn into a different person. And he said, there's no reason you can't bring that person into who you are as an executive every day. And I said, yeah, but that's my personal life, and it's very different. And he said, but look at the relationship we've just built tonight. You didn't start off super friendly to me, but once you became a human, you became much more approachable, and we're still having a great conversation. And I understand my agency will not work for you, but I like you now. We had a really meaningful engagement. And I thought that's a very, very good point. He actually changed my entire way I approached compartmentalizing my professional life and my personal life. And I said earlier, to answer one of your previous questions, I'm okay with the messy middle. I think I probably wasn't before Will. And now it is all integrated because we're all one human being. And because of Will, I was then invited to join him on stage at C2, which is a large event in Montreal. And as we were on stage speaking, him, Carla Hussein, and I, and she's still a dear friend. She's amazing. I think she's the CMO of Citi now, something really important and big. But we were talking on stage, and somehow he brought up this wall of photos, and I just mentioned it. And then that became an invitation to go speak at Hatch with Yarrow Craner. Yes. And at Hatch was the first time I gave a talk called The Spare Room, and that eventually became the book. So yes, actually, long answer, I apologize, but it does all go back to that day with Will.
I mean, what's so interesting too is earlier you talked about how this humanity, how these parts of yourself, you actually now integrate into work, and it makes you a better leader. So it's so interesting how when we really become, I think, more holistic in the way that we live and integrate ourselves and bring that humanity to everything we do, somehow relationships and dynamics in relationships shift. They become softer somehow. People become much more receptive when they know what it is we care about so much and love. So in closing, my last question to you would be this: is there anything that we haven't touched on or that I haven't asked that you would love to share with our audience?
I think you just touched on something I think is interesting, which is we talked a lot about humility, but we also talked a lot about the confidence to go forward and be holistically who we are. I don't think those are two mutually exclusive things, though I feel that sometimes in society, humility and confidence are seen as two ends of a spectrum. I think that's one of those integrated opportunities of yes and, which is how can you be humble and confident? I think maybe there's a recipe there. I mean, think about Martin Luther King Jr. He was very humble. He was also very confident, and he inspired amazing followership. Maybe the best leaders are both humble and confident. They know they can do so much more, and they know they're still relatively small in a very big world, but they're confident enough to say, and yet I want to leave as big and as meaningful of a mark as I can in this little life of mine.
It's really true, and that's so beautifully spoken. Emily Chang, what a pleasure. What a pleasure to have been with you. Thank you so much.
Oh, you too, Dr. Elizabeth. Thank you for having me.